And here again, we see another finished version of the 5 images that we were looking at before, with the hands, the rock, and the background. But before, it had the tree groves. This time the artist chose to use the mountains. So kind of changes the feel, the meaning. It's interesting. So again, this is black and white photography done in 1970. In this photograph of a porch, Provincetown, 1977, is the beginning of color. So before it was all black and white. 1970, in the 1970s, Kodak introduced a new color techniques that allowed greater control over the color image. It was durable, and the colors were really bright and beautiful. And we'll talk a little bit more in the next slide about the development of it. But in this image, it's just an interesting contrast to have that the lightning striking off on the ocean, and then you have the light inside the house and then in the porch. So the colors are just beautiful here. You have blue like framed by the porch, like they're paintings. Okay, here's another example of color photography. The artist, the photographer, worked for Rolling Stones, and she was trying to capture something of the spirit of each of the celebrities that she was shooting. The idea of the public face of stardom and then the private person behind the mask. We have complementary colors of red and green here, make the nude pop out. Finley, the subject of the photo, would shock audiences by undressing before them as she railed about society's reactions to feminine sexuality. The artist presents Finley as a classical nude similar to Degas' photographs. So I want you to pause here and take a minute, or actually look at this image and then look at the next one. And I want you to talk about the differences and similarities between this photo and then Degas' nude in the next image. So as you can see, this is posed Edgar Degas's after the bath, woman drying her hair. The La Baroness, can't say her name, Karen Finley at her home in Nantucket. That photograph is posed exactly like this, and it's to compare and contrast how things haven't really changed. This photograph was done in 1896, and you can see it's a black and white. The focus is the nude figure. It lacks the contrast in color because they didn't have color like in the previous photograph. But what you want to write about and talk about is femininity, the idea of the classic nude. Okay, here's another color print, Ocean 2, 2010. It has been shot up above the ocean, and it is incredibly abstract. It looks almost like a painting, but you know that it is a realistic portrait of an ocean in the area. So as I talk about this, I want you to keep this image in mind as well as the one after, because I want you to do a compare and contrast between the two. This is, before I even do that, I need to define digital photography. In the 1960s, Polaroid cameras and film became inexpensive ways of color processing for both Kodak film, and it contributed to the growing culture's taste for color images. In this, I want you to, it's NL, The Constructing of Helen, 2007. We are witness to the history of Helen as the monumental creation of a patriotic culture. From Helen to the 19th century, the NNL parallels from the vantage point of contemporary feminist thought. An actual model is transformed digitally into a giant sculpture. It is paralleled or a parody of the late 19th century academic paintings, like the ones that we're going to see next. Quickly, let me define digital photography. In the 1960s, Polaroid cameras and film were an inexpensive color processing for Kodak film. Both contribute to a growing culture's taste for colored images. And in The Constructing of Helen, a photo in 2007, we are witness to the history of Helen as the monumental creation of a patriotic culture, from Homer to the 19th century. The photographer puts us at the vantage point of contemporary feminist thought, an actual model transformed digitally into a giant sculpture. It is parallel or a parody of the late 19th century academic paintings, like the one that we're going to see next. Okay, The Birth of Venus, painted in 1863. Now looking at this one and looking at the photograph that was previous, I'd like you to write a compare and contrast between the two. We see here the photograph before was designed to revise our sense of Greek history by focusing not on the heroes of the Homer epic, but on Helen herself. What do we know of her? 3,000 years of notoriety, she remains strangely silent as the most beautiful and destructive objectification of male anxiety and desire. So this was painted before. The photographer that we saw in the previous image used it as an inspiration to poke fun at classical female nudity. Okay, so we have the birth of film. Film, assembling a film, the process of editing. Editing is the process of arranging the sequence of a film after it has been shot in its entirety. Shots. Each one is a continuous sequence of film frames, each unbroken continuous sequence of a movie frame with the camera still rolling. This is Ledger's films seem to invite the exploration of rhythm and repetition as principles of design. The artist used a number of different images, smiling lips, wine bottles, metallic discs, working mechanisms, and pure shapes such as circles, squares, and triangles. By repeating the images, the artist creates a visual rhythm or dance like a ballet.